think that started. Sounds promising.
Thanks a lot, Holly. Our three speakers today are Professor Dr. Juha Saunavaara from the Arctic Research Center at Hokkaido University in Sapporo, Japan. Dr. Federica Cristani from the Institute of International Relations in Prague, the Czech Republic, and Mirva Salminen from the law faculty at the University of Lapland in Rovaniemi, Finland. We have three people who are going to talk about regulatory issues from different perspectives, from historic perspective, or connectivity perspective, legal perspective, and a cybersecurity perspective. Thankful that you all have found the time to participate, even though it's a rather unusual time for our webinars. And with that, I'd like to get started and ask Juha Saunavaara for his presentation on the topic of the global submarine fiber optic cable network and its vulnerability to natural and man-made disasters. Juha, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you see my slides?
We can see your slides, yes.
Okay. Again, thanks for having me here today. I'm planning to talk about, fiber optic cables and man-made disasters and natural disasters. This is just describing the content of my presentation. So it's going to be general information concerning the global network, few words about the infrastructure, then the submarine fiber optic cables and natural and man-made disasters. The picture here tries to describe the general structure of submarine fiber optic cables. So it's depending on the armoring, we are talking about 20 to 50 millimeters in diameter. And again, I'm going to talk about submarine fiber optic cables. So quite often when I start my speech, I start by saying that, world is not wireless and internet is not in clouds, but internet is at the bottom of the sea and oceans, and also in data centers that are often located near to the landing stations of submarine fiber optic cables. So fiber optic cables, they are the backbone for the internet and for the global digital communication. And while talking about the fiber optics, I don't want to underestimate the importance of other ways of other solutions providing connectivity, satellites, fixed wireless, mobile wireless. They all have important roles to play. I'm interested in Arctic region, and it's obviously clear that the point-to-point technology like fiber optics is not the perfect solution for all Arctic regions, for example. Again, different connectivity solutions, they very much depend on each other. They are complementing each other and offering solutions in different circumstances. But then again, it's submarine fiber optic cables that carries 99% of the all transoceanic digital communication. So they are highly important. What we have here is a map describing the current submarine fiber optic cable routes. The exact routes of these cables is not public information, but it's apparently not too difficult to figure out the exact route at the bottom of the sea either. The situation is obviously constantly changing, but nowadays we have something between 430 and 450 cable systems in operation. It makes more than 1.2 million kilometers of submarine cable. And well, the story describing how this map, what we see here, how it came into being, it's an interesting one, but it's a bit too long to be told in detail today. But I just would like to mention a few features that I found both interesting and important. First, continuity. It's an interesting story that we had our first submarine telegraph cables or wires in mid-1850s. And then when we start building submarine telephone cables in 1950s, the telephone lines followed the old routes of the submarine telegraph lines. And then when in the 1980s, we start building fiber optic cables, they actually often follow the old routes of the submarine telephone cables. Then there is something that I had marked here as a lack of overall planning. So it just refers to the fact that the existing global network structure. It has emerged as an uncontrolled process. What we see is a map. It's an outcome. This map is an outcome of decisions made by private enterprises in different times in different parts of the world. And even today, we do not have any international governing body that would oversee the overall development of the global network. What we have, however, is for example, the International Cable Protection Committee, ICPC. That's a forum for international cooperation that provides technical and legal and environmental information about submarine cables. We also have something called International Telecommunication Union, or ITU, and ITU is a United Nations specialized agency for information and communication technologies. What ITU does is it coordinates global radio frequency spectrum. It allocates satellite orbits and things like that. It plays an important role in standardization, the technical standardization. So and some of this technical standardization is also related to submarine cables. However, ITU it does not play any role, kind of a coordinating role that could decide where, when, or by whom submarine cables are built. But still, this is obviously a regulated issue. In my slide, it mentions the usual suspects that are mentioned when somebody describes the history of this regulation of submarine cables. So the 1884 Convention for Protection of Submarine Telegraph Cables. Then in 1950s we have Geneva Conventions, and today United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, and its provisions on submarine cables, they form the foundation for our current international legal regime. And I have listed here things that UNCLOS regulates or concerns. It concerns about surveying the cable routes, laying, repairing, maintaining the cables. Then it says something about the rights and obligations of coastal and other states in situations where the cable operations take place in different types of sea areas. Unfortunately, I'm not a legal scholar, so it's not my field to go into details in my expertise to go in details of these legal regulations. What is also worth pointing out, however, is that besides the international law, submarine fiber optic cables are also subject to national legislation, which often introduces regulations and procedures that are not included in UNCLOS. For example, some countries have established rules concerning the protected areas, the protection areas around submarine cables. Then I wanted to add this slide describing one critical part of this global telecommunication infrastructure. This is a cable landing station that connects the terrestrial networks to subsea telecommunication network. What we can see here is two landing stations from Hokkaido. One is international, one is domestic. Pictures up the two pictures upside the upper part, they are taken by myself last weekend, and then the two at the bottom, they are from Google Maps, and this kind of street view picture. Again, it's obvious that there are different types of landing stations. Some are really big, some are really small, as we can see. They have, they are, vulnerable for natural disasters. I would say they are really close to the sea, obviously, almost on the sea level. So even a relatively small tsunami could cause stress, for example, in these two facilities. When it comes to man-made disasters, usually landing stations take this kind of low publicity approach. So they are critical infrastructure, but they try not to stand out. So there's no cars around them. There's no massive stay out signs in there. It's kind of the less people pay attention to these facilities, the better. But then the problem is that if somebody would actually pay attention to these facilities, they would be relatively easy targets for sabotage. When it comes to infrastructure in general, what infrastructure is. This is from a paper that I actually co-authored with Mirva and one other co-author. Infrastructure is a matter which enables the movements of other matters. They are built networks facilitating the flow of goods and people or ideas. One important thing is infrastructure often escapes public awareness, and infrastructure draws attention, and it's experienced only when they fail, and when the infrastructure is unable to deliver what is usually taken for granted. Sometimes the infrastructure is damaged by natural disasters that occur without prior warning, that come unexpectedly and are very intensive, like earthquakes. Or then we can have processes that take much longer period of time. Here we have erosion that is often nowadays related to global warming and climate change. Then obviously we also have cases where infrastructure stops functioning because of man-made activities. When it comes to submarine cables, we have approximately 200 cable falls around the world each year. So it doesn't sound too many considering the size of the infrastructure itself. One thing that is also worth pointing out that we have seen many changes in cable structure and like cable technology, for example, great jumps forward, and then we have new owners, we have new actors who are developing and building their cables. So many changes in the global network, but the risks have remained more or less the same. Bottom contact phishing has been and still is. It has been the #1 threat for decades, and it is still. What has changed is that bottom contact phishing is going into deeper waters. So traditionally, we have buried submarine cables until let's say 1,000 meters depth. Nowadays, they are burying cables down to depths of 1,500 up to 2,000 meters to protect them mainly for the phishing-related activities. Okay, and then natural disasters. Again, natural events, earthquakes, submarine landslides, and things like that, they can damage, and they have damaged submarine cable systems. But it is important to point out that natural events typically amount less than 5% of the total amount of cable falls. And usually the effects are regional or somehow spatially limited. Yet I will say a few words about the over concentration of this infrastructure in a moment, and that kind of should warn us that if the natural disaster happens in the right place or maybe in the wrong place, it can have really devastating effects that are widely spread. We have many examples. We have the 2003 Algeria earthquake damaging both the submarine cables and satellite landing stations, and the whole country was almost isolated from the rest of the world. We have pretty well-known case from 2009 Taiwan, where we had a typhoon that was causing flooding in the rivers, and then carried a vast amount of sediments to the sea or ocean. And then the sediments flowed across the seabed, and they broke the several cables, and then several difficulties in Taiwan, but also countries nearby. And then obviously we have Japan, March 2011 earthquake, tsunami. The map is showing the cables in Japan. The yellow ones were the ones that were still functioning, and the white ones are the ones that ceased to function. So again, especially the connections between Japan and United States or North America, they were severely hit, all partly because the submarine infrastructure is and this cable infrastructure is highly concentrated in Japan. Then there's also environmental change. National Geographic published this article a few years back describing what the sea level rise could cause for the submarine fiber optic cable infrastructure. And it's not only the sea level rise. In the future, I guess we will see increased number of extreme weather events like typhoons or something like that, that as we have seen in the past, they can cause serious troubles for our infrastructure. I think I have to say something about the sharks. The relationship between the submarine cables and marine animals has received much attention. But there, people in the industry have said that, the idea that sharks are a threat to submarine cables, it is the biggest myth cited in the press. We have well-known cases from 1980s when crocodile sharks attacked one of the first deep water fiber optic cable. But since then, these issues have been solved, and during the recent years, we have not received any animal-related cable faults. Then we obviously have these man-made threats. Again, as mentioned, deep bottom contact fishing. Then we have anchors. Anchors is the number two risk. Then there's something like dredging, or when the process of clearing seabed from scooping out mud and weeds and whatnot. What is happening is that there is a worldwide interest in the development of, let's say, offshore renewable energy, for example. We have interest in deep sea mining and that kind of, new users of the seabed that there are new type of activities with close proximity to submarine cables that can be seen as a threat. Then we have intentional, we have unintentional, and something in between. We have these examples of 75-year-old Georgian woman was scavenging for copper to be sold as a scrap metal, and then she managed to cut internet connection from the whole country of Azerbaijan, from Armenia, sorry. Also Georgia and Azerbaijan were affected. Then we have this example from Vietnam when local fishermen removed undersea submarine cable intending to sell it in the black market, and then it took 3 months time to repair. Then we have, sabotage. We have acts of terror carried out by hackers, cyber attackers, terrorists, and state actors. We have had some research done. This quotation is from Artic report, the Arctic Connect project and cybersecurity. So one thing is about tapping, eavesdropping the information. The picture here is from Forbes. It tries to describe how Russian submarines can do it. Well, that's one thing. Although people are also saying that if you want to tap, it is easier to do in landing stations or in terrestrial environment than at the seabed. But some countries in the world are capable of doing it. To attack, to try to damage these cables, it's obviously much easier. Then there are different opinions, whether an attack, or if you let's say, damage one cable and it keeps the function, whether it affects. Some people are saying that, emphasizing the high degree of redundancy, that it's not a big issue if somebody attacks one cable. But then again, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that this is very much over-concentrated infrastructure. And if somebody attacks cable in certain locations, there are plenty of cables with close proximity with each other. And again, it's the landing stations that have often been mentioned as the easiest target. This slide here is just to try to remind you of the over-concentration. We have places like Alexandria in Egypt, we have Malacca Strait, and things like that. There's also a map describing the situation in Japan where we have basically 2 major landing areas. And the fact that we have these choke points, it's not my, this is not my own, finding. We have known that for a long time. Influential Rokuchi report from 2010 paid attention to the problem of choke points and said that we need to do something for this issue. But unfortunately, we have not done too much. Again, there's reasons why the map looks like this, but no time to go into details today. Then there's a question, what should we do? I think I have almost used my time, but there are different approaches. A few examples I took. there are those approaches emphasizing that it's international law and regulation, and that's the angle how we should, protect our cable system and make it more reliable. Then others are pointing towards innovations and inventions and technological approach. AUV, autonomous undersea vehicles have been mentioned as an example. Then I just point out that they're like, what if we go do what we have done even today, but do it to more of it, like approaching physical security by adding armoring or bring our cables even deeper and so on. But then there comes the question, what is the environmental impact? What is the economic feasibility? And would it actually help? Those kind of questions. I have prepared an epilogue kind of telling you something about smart cables or dual use cables and how submarine fiber optic cables can actually help us to prevent or predict different disasters. But I think I have used my time. So if you have questions, we can come back to this issue as well. But I think I will stop here to make sure that other speakers will also have enough time. So looking forward to hear your comments and your questions. Thank you.
Many thanks, Juha. As I said, we'll have the discussion after our three presentations, but are there any questions, urgent questions right away? All right. Thanks so much for your presentation. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion afterwards, as I actually have a whole bunch of questions. Our next speaker is Dr. Federica Cristani. Dr. Cristani is senior researcher at the Institute of International Relations in Prague, and she's going to talk about the impact of disasters on the transfer of technology from the perspective of international economic law. Federica?
Thank you so much, Stefan. Thank you, and good morning, good evening, everyone. I'm sharing firstly my screen. So let's see if I manage. You should be able to see it. No?
Yes, we can see your screen. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Stefan, for this kindest invitation, and thank you also to the Ideal Network for the opportunity to share in this this initial stage of my research on this topic, the impact disaster technology transfer from an international economic law perspective, because well, I have an international law, economic law background. This is why I'm taking this view today. And this is just a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to give a brief overview of what is the regulatory framework when it comes to technology transfer in the context of disasters. Firstly, from taking the provisions dealing with technology transfer in this international disaster law instruments, and then moving to international economic law instruments. And I'm starting here with some declarations from the last World Trade Organization's Ministerial Conference that took place in Buenos Aires in 2017. And it was very interesting. Here you see just two excerpts from the representatives of St. Lucia in Guatemala, but there were actually many representatives of, especially from the group of small vulnerable economies and CARICOM countries, just highlighting how natural disasters and disasters in general have a real devastating impact on national economies. And actually, well, it is quite intuitive that actually when there is a disaster, there is also an impact on economy. But what is this kind of impact? Actually, this impact can manifest in different forms and in manifold sectors. We have negative effects on exports from the disaster-affected country, especially agricultural exports. When it comes to natural disaster, agricultural exports are the first ones to be affected. And there is also an impact on imports, because when normally disaster-affected countries need to import more goods, more services, more technology. We will see a little bit later, especially when it comes to recovery and reconstruction. And so imports plays a real critical role in the recovery. And also disaster generally creates debt, because governments of disaster-affected countries need to borrow to finance recovery, and this creates debt. And the problem here, and when I was starting to look at the real impact of disaster on the economy, is the fact that there are not so many. There are many figures and data on the economic impact of disasters, but the fact is that these data are normally aggregated data, meaning that they don't really, it's quite difficult then to differentiate the impact on the economy of disasters and the impact of the economy of concurrent other crises or other phenomena that may happen, because when there is a disaster can be also some migration issue, there can be economic crisis issues that appear at the same time, and so it's quite difficult sometimes to understand what is the impact of the disaster and what is the impact of the other phenomena that happen. And this is something, so it's quite difficult to find figures and data, especially when it comes to smaller scale disasters. And here I just put the covers of two researchers that were financed by the World Trade Organization 2018, so quite recent, on the legal framework that can apply in the context of disasters, in the context of natural disasters. So these two studies underline the relationship between natural disaster and trade, and trying to and offer the legal map, especially when it comes to the provisions of WTO agreements in the context of disaster. And what about when we're talking about economy, we're talking about many issues. Here today I'm talking about technology transfer, but what do we mean when we talk about technology transfer? Actually, technology transfer may mean many things. Here I'm just putting the definitions that were delivered by UNCTAD and the World Intellectual Property Organizations, and they were actually just trying to give a general definition of what is technology transfer. Technology transfer is generally understood as the process of sharing ideas, knowledge, technology, and skills with another individual or institution. And so this knowledge can be many things, can be embodied in hardware, plant, machinery, equipment, can be also patents, know-how, trademarks. And the technology transfer may happen in many ways. We can have an explicit contractual arrangement, a license between businesses, business partners, but it can be also through foreign direct investment, so also through the establishment of subsidiaries in another country. So it may take many forms, and because it takes many forms, it's also quite difficult to find a uniform regulatory framework when it comes to technology transfer. In fact, we have quite a fragmented picture here, because technology transfer can mean many things and can happen in many ways. And but before moving to the regulatory framework, just to have an idea how technology transfer can be affected by disasters. Well, first of all, disaster can affect the import of technology, because normally when it comes there is natural disaster, there is some problems in importing technology, also technology that can be useful for disaster risk management because of customs clearance delays. And this is, for example, something that was underlined by the IFRC report on Nepal in 2014, where it was observed that some technology that could, some telecommunication technology that could have been very useful in disaster risk management, actually it was very difficult to use because because of the tax licenses and imports that were granted. And also technology is the effect of disaster on technology appears also when disaster affected countries participate in global value chains. For example, when there were floodings in Thailand or the earthquake and tsunami in Japan, and this had a major impact also on the production network for cars and electronic products, because these countries were part of the global value chains. So when there is a disaster in this country, this blocks some part of the global value chains. And technology transfer is not only affected by natural disasters, it's also useful for the recovery phase in disaster affected countries. When there is the need to rebuild infrastructure of any kind, there is the need also to import technology, know-how, so there is a technology transfer flow. And when here a problem when it comes to technology transfer again is about data, because also was reported by UNCTAD, actually because technology transfer is channeled in different ways, it's difficult to trace how the flow of technology transfers. So it's quite difficult to understand really the amount and how actually technology transfer is happening. And this is also why when you lack the data, it's also different. It's also difficult to have a uniform, homogeneous, and to create an homogeneous regulatory framework of reference. And here I found technology transfer provisions. You can find them either in international disaster law instruments and also international economic law instruments. And so you have pieces of provisions as far as almost everywhere. When it comes to international disaster law, you have treaties dealing with the entry of foreign relief goods and equipment, which also include technology. And but here the scope of the treaties may vary, and also because it can cover many one type of disaster or specific events, and also the commitments may vary according to the conventions. So you have provisions that apply in specific instances. And when it comes to here, I found quite interesting the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction. In the Sendai framework, there are not really trade suggestions of specific trade measures that states may adopt, but there is an emphasis on the need to cooperate and to focus on technology transfer. You have in the guiding principle when it is stressed that developing countries need adequate, sustainable, timely provisions of support, including through technology transfer from developed countries. And this is a kind of leitmotif because it is always it is often stressed in international instruments that there is a need of cooperation in order to facilitate technology transfer from developed countries to developing countries. You see also in the priority for action, and especially in part 6 on the international cooperation global partnership, there is this emphasis on the need of cooperation to enhance technology transfer. And also this is also reiterated in the draft articles on the protection of persons in the event of disasters, even though in the articles themselves it is not expressly, they do not expressly refer to technology transfer, but in the commentary to Article 8, it is said that formal cooperation may also include technology transfer. So there is this stress on the need to cooperate to facilitate technology transfer, and especially there is the idea to facilitate technology transfer by waiving custom duties. So there is, and is something that this suggestion, this commitment to waive from custom duties, it's also something that you find in regional instruments. Here I put two examples from the Council of Europe and the Black Sea Economic Cooperation Agreement, and also the bilateral level. Sometimes it may happen in the bilateral agreements or framework agreements between countries on cooperation in disaster situation. It is also stressed also the need to cooperate to facilitate technology transfer. So and the international, so when it comes to international disaster law instruments, there is the reference, there is this stress to cooperate to facilitate technology transfer, especially when it comes to technology transfer that is needed in the recovery phase, even though it is not very clear how this technology transfer should occur and which kind of measure, trade measures states should actually adopt. What about international economic law instruments? Well, international economic law instruments, you don't find really so many provisions dealing expressly with disasters. Here in the WTO agreements, I found that these three provisions which refer expressly to natural disasters as a circumstance that could justify the waiver of some or the relaxation of some commitments. And when it comes to technology, the technology transfer, the most referred article is the one included in the TRIPS agreement, the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights. It's Article 66, which provides that developed countries members shall promote and encourage technology transfer to least developed countries members. And even though this article does not refer to disaster situation, it's not an exceptional provision. It's a general provision, something that actually developed countries should do also in ordinary times, not just when it comes to disaster. It has been really, is the article that has been invoked as the one that should apply actually also in the context of disaster. And also most recently, in the report, in the last report of the Working Group on Trade and Transfer of Technology, it is said that this article should apply, for example, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, to ensure technology transfer from developed countries to developing countries when it comes to COVID-19 related health technology. And also, this also is just another statement made by Bangladesh, for example, at the symposium at the World Trade Organization in 2019, where it was stressed that Article 66 should apply also in the context of disaster. There was this emphasis on the need to facilitate the technology transfer from developed countries to developing countries. And as I was saying, because technology transfer may happen in different forms, you find provisions also in other international economic instruments, like in international agreement, for example, this one from the Framework Cooperation Agreement between Mercosur and the European Union, or regional agreements like in the new NAFTA and in this ASEAN Framework Agreement on Intellectual Property Cooperation, and also in bilateral agreements. Can be also bilateral trade agreements or bilateral investment agreements that include sometimes include reference to technology transfer with an emphasis also here on the need to cooperate to facilitate the flows of technology. And the most, sometimes you find at the national level, it's where you find national regulations dealing with technology transfer, also in the context of disasters. For example, you have Georgia patent law, which contains limitation on the exclusive right of patent when it comes in the context of natural disaster, pandemic, others. All states can sometimes adopt measures in order to facilitate trade flows and also may include technology transfer flows due to exceptional circumstances, also like disasters. Sometimes governments also cooperate with private companies to increase exports of technology disasters. For example, in Japan, it's very interesting this case that Japan has established the Japan International Public-Private Association for Disaster Risk Reduction with the aim to facilitate export of technology for disaster risk management to developing countries. So overall, the picture is really fragmented, as you can see, but there are provisions actually dealing with the technology and stressing the need to facilitate technology flows, also in the context of disasters. And but now I'm stopping here. I see that my time has come to an end, and but I'm very looking forward also to comments and discussion on it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Federica, for a really very interesting presentation, which also has generated a bit of discussion in the chat as well. Thanks very, very much. Was going to talk about cybersecurity in times of crisis, looking at the Finnish experiences in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Mirva, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I will need a little bit of help because I know that you see the wrong screen at the moment. So display settings, swap. It's right now, correct? No, it's the normal.
Looks
right?
good, yes. Yes.
Okay, good. So hi to everybody, great to be here. A word of warning first, I have a 11 weeks old puppy with me, so if there's some strange voices on the background, that's because of her. She also snores when she sleeps, so let's see what happens. A little bit about my background first. I'm also not a legal scholar. My background is strongly in security studies, so international relations, political science, art of war, and then security studies in themselves. I've been working on cybersecurity for about 10 years. And now when I was thinking like how to speak to you, because my expertise is nothing disaster specific, but cybersecurity specific. So I thought, okay, let's talk about the Finnish experiences during the current pandemic. What I will try to go through quickly is different views to cybersecurity, what it means, what is the comprehensive security model in Finland within which we have tried to manage the COVID situation, implications of the pandemic on cybersecurity, and then one particular case, if I make it that far. And then on the slide, there are also some of the books that I've been operating or working on over the years. So the first is very much from the defense perspective. Then it moved on to organizations, management in organizations, and the latest to human security perspective to cybersecurity. So there are different views of what we are actually talking about. That's why I have them 3 different views to cybersecurity. So let's start with them. The eldest one clearly is the information security perspective. And then around 2000, well, it was in the 90s already when you have the first Rand Corporation report about how cyber war is coming. So that's when it started to, the digital issues became gradually national security issues, especially in the 21st century. And then the latest development, at least in Finland, is digital security. So what is different in these different perspectives? We can look at the values that are the referent objects, what is being secured. So usually information security, what is being secured is information, clearly, simply. In national cybersecurity, it's critical infrastructures or functions vital to society. And then in this digital security perspective, it's people's and communities' everyday life. And this is now popping up. It's very recent development in Finland as well. So in the 2018, 2019, that's when the development started. And once the values that are being protected, once the referent objects change, it also changes what is seen as a threat. And I will go through different threat tables in a bit from these three different perspectives. And when you have different values that you're protecting, you have different threats that are targeting them or are against those values, then you also need different security measures taken by different security actors. That's why these three perspectives are complementary when we are trying to protect digital sphere that has more or less penetrated all different functions and structures of society in contemporary societies in times of crisis, but also in normal conditions. So the change of discourse in Finland, you can see it from here. So with a colleague, we computed it a little bit of analysis on our behalf and checked the different wordings in Finnish national security strategies of different levels and the crucial reports and sub-strategies and so forth. And there's been a drastic change, as you can see. So from 2013, when the first Finnish national cybersecurity strategy was published, there's a massive increase in cybersecurity discourse, and the information security discourse somehow just vanishes to the background. And again, in 2019, digital security became to blurry the waters a little bit more. And about the threat table, so this is taken from the European Network and Information Security Agency, and this is the technical threat table, which talks about malware or web-based attacks, phishing, web application attacks, and so forth. This is 2019 threat table. So this is engineers talking to engineers. And then this is the traditional information security view to a certain extent. But then you have the national security perspective, and this is taken from Finland's National Cybersecurity Strategy 2013. So it looks very different. Instead of having these technical threats, malware, cryptojacking, things like that, you actually have a cyber activism or hacktivism, crime, espionage, terrorism, and cyber operations, which means cyber war, basically. And then in the Finnish comprehensive security model, all the different levels of society are included. So cyber risk against an individual are at the very core. Then it goes to the societal level, to the state level, and international level as well. And the idea is that all these different levels are important in securing the society from different sources of cyber threats and ensuring that the society operates regardless of whatever happens. Let's put it that way. And then the digital security perspective. So this is now being developed, the concept is being developed, the Ministry of Finance and under it, the Digital and Population Data Services Agency. And then who is in charge of developing all the public services, digital public services within the Finnish state. So the digital security then concerns secure services and operating environment for all areas of public administration. The agency also provides an analyzed overview of digital security, which is available to all. So not only to selected organizations that have access to intelligence, but more of a public situational awareness raising campaign there on the background. And then what is important here is that digital security goes all the way to the level of individual people. So you can learn, act safely and in dangerous situations, but also you can learn to act safely in normal conditions. So they provide different trainings that probably, I don't know, maybe will become some kind of civic skill there's a lot of digital skills as a civic skill discussion going on in Finland, but so far there has been really very little other development than advice given. So again, training, but it's still more than read this report and then you will know what cybersecurity is about. So 3 different perspectives. Then the comprehensive security model. It is nothing new, it's pretty unique in the world, but the Finnish state started developing it after the First World War, especially after the Second World War. On the background is the geographical facts: 5.5 million people living in an area that is about 340,000 square kilometers, with a long border with Russia, and our experiences from the Second World War, of course, they're on the background, which was a bit tricky situation. And the current security strategy for society is from 2017, and that is the most central, most pivotal security strategy in the Finnish state. So it's not defense strategy, it's the security strategy for society that is even more important. And what it does, it explains and provides the functions vital to society. You can see those listed there. There are 7 of them at the moment. And different ways of protecting them, stating who is in charge of doing what. So in principle, the system goes so that the Prime Minister is in charge of making the decisions in times of crisis, but then depending on which branch of government, which sector, which ministries field the disaster hits or the security situation hits, is in charge of running the day-to-day operations. And other sectors of society, other ministries and other branches of government can help. And then it goes to, from the state level, it goes down to the level of regions. You have regional agencies doing preparedness and these operations during the times of crisis at the regional level, and then it goes down to municipalities, and then further down to different organizations, both public and private sector, and corporations included, research institutions included, and business operators, like I said, and then all the way to the citizens. So in principle, we all in this country have a responsibility to defend our country, and that can be extended to different functions in different security situations and in times of different crises. So it's a proper comprehensive approach, overall, the whole of government approach, including the private sector as well. And then there are 3 security situations. So usually it's normal conditions, then it's disturbances under normal conditions. And then if it's the case of emergencies, as COVID-19 was last spring and this spring again, then the State of Emergency Act can be applied, and it has been enforced twice, last spring and this spring. And this gives special powers to the government to restrict people's freedoms, different fundamental freedoms. And usually the reason there on the background has been that there were needs for social distancing, keeping people separate from one another. Of course, people don't follow advice. You need to put up bigger, stronger authoritative schemes. And then the State of Emergency Act was used on the background to make this possible. And that was the first time after the Second World War that Finland resorted to the use of that act. And on top of social distancing, what has been very important as well is the continuity management, so security of supply of different, not only medical supplies, but also food sector. Finland is very much dependent on imports on all different societal sectors. So continuity management within the country, but also so that the international trade operates, has been very important. And in the field of cybersecurity, I'm sorry, this is a bit fragmented, but it will all come together eventually. So in the field of cybersecurity, there are 2 agencies that are especially important. So it's the National Cybersecurity Center, which has the general responsibilities that cybersecurity centers have. It's not an operational, it provides advice and support, but it doesn't take over any other actors' responsibilities. So one of the important things here is that the arrangements created for normal conditions will stay in force during disturbances and emergencies, but the activities and cooperation between different actors will become intensified. So nobody takes over anybody, but the normal the arrangements will stay, and the authorities in charge might request help from other sectors. But for example, MOD doesn't take over in times of crisis. And then there's the Digital Population and Data Services Agency, which is more, like I mentioned, responsible for the public services and individuals' digital security. Important were, of course, cybersecurity corporations. Cybersecurity is to a great extent commercialized and privatized, and then also voluntary organizations. So there was geeks. There were geeks who came up with the idea that, by the way, we can actually help people who are struggling with different distance working, distance schooling solutions, and of course there are also this kind of technical threats targeting individual human beings. So no state agency was in charge of helping those people, and there were too many issues going on at the same time. So the geeks who had the skills and knew what to do, they put up a voluntary organization. You could give them a ring and ask advice and then help if you had a situation, for example, at home or in your SME. So what happened when the COVID hit and the social distancing regulations or the practices were taking place? So there was a digital leap on all sectors of society. This morning, I just read a piece of news according to which this means that even the small corporations learn to use how to use Teams and Zoom, but a digitalization of the core functions of the societies actually didn't go forward to the extent that it could have been. So there's still a lot to do in the digitalization of the society. Having said that, Finland still scores very much at the top of the European Digital Economy and Society Index. So we were already a highly digitalized society before the COVID-19, but now we are even more digitalized nowadays. And according to the National Emergency Supply Agency, there have been some issues with network capacity. In general, it has been good enough, but for the future, what should be still considered is how to ensure that the network capacity will hold, that it will be good enough, it will be available. There were some supply issues with ICT equipment and spare parts. So of course, then you need to renegotiate the supply chains and especially kind of create redundancy. There were some issues with cloud services, digital platforms, usually with international American and multinational corporations, which are providing services throughout the world. So Finland being a small country, of course, our needs are not at the top of their list. What needs to be ensured is the electricity supply, and I will not go into that because it's a bit different discussion. This time there was no difficulties with that either. What needs to be discussed, internet traffic prioritization. Sometime last spring, there were discussions, for example, throughout the world, how Netflix and other entertainment providers actually put the quality of their services down so that the networks were able to take the reduced service. So in Finland, what should be discussed is what is the order of traffic prioritization in the future, and then also we need to improve the communication channels between authorities, but also to the general public to scrap out disinformation, misinformation, or different sorts of conspiracy theories and so forth. So it showed the COVID-19 crisis showed that the preparedness arrangements do work to an extent. Of course, there's still need to improve what has been done. There's been a little bit of coughing here and there. And what needs to be also reconsidered is the preparedness obligations to different sectors, especially in the private sector. Who should be doing what and how much the state can oblige, because currently those are still based on voluntary, the firms voluntary becoming part of the preparedness arrangements. So, and what was the information? What happened during the COVID-19 crisis? The National Cybersecurity Center published, this was only in March 2020, but they publish on a monthly basis so-called cyber weather. So where there's been a little bit of rain or storm and where the problems are, where things are going very well. So in March 2020, they provided this kind of Corona special, implicating more or less what they assumed that will become issues and which to an extent became issues later on as well. So you can read those through or glimpse them through. I will go forward. There's no time for actually to read absolutely everything, but the report is always bracketed into data breaches and leaks, scams and phishing, malware and vulnerabilities, automation questions, network performance and spying. And as you can see, the network performance in March is still doing rather well. And then they assume that top 5 corona cyber threats will be that vulnerabilities are not patched because nobody is at work. Corona themed phishing and scam attempts will increase as they did. Ransom attacks with wide-ranging effects that also took place. I will come back to that later. Staff shortages, yes, because you don't have people in their postings and so on. People are trying to organize their daily lives when you're supposed to stay at home and teach your kids and all that at the same time. And then also, of course, denial of service attacks, which also took place. So these were the issues that were perceived beforehand that would take place, and then those also took place to different extent. However, not however yet, more like still on this theme. So a digital leap took place in both sides, meaning both on the law enforcement side and also on the criminal side, or the good and the bad. Let's put it in a very simple way. Towards the end of summer 2020, cybercrime started to activate because then the digital leap had been taken also on the criminal side. So first there was a halt of operation on both sides, and then because organizations were just thinking how to digitalize and how to run this. But then towards the end of summer 2020, there was more and more crime activities. In autumn, phishing, scams, all of those increased. And then interestingly, espionage, of course, as well. So not just only vaccinations or related economic espionage, but state-to-state espionage as well. And then we had a major case in the health security sector at the same time as we have the pandemic going on. So the biggest fear in the Finnish system is that you have a big emergency, something going on, and then something else happens at the same time. And that happened in October 2020. And of course, then there was also a cybersecurity breach in the parliament, which was published in December, but that had taken place already earlier as well. So the implications on digital security, so more on the public sector and everyday life type of to those type of situations. So nearly 60% of the personnel in Finland transitioned to remote work, and there was 55% increase in the use of digital public services. No big problems, and usually it has been seen because of the systemic development of digital society from the mid-1990s. Some temporary difficulties with availability of certain ICT devices. So this goes hand in hand with an earlier report of the National Emergency Supply Agency. And then 3 threats especially occurred. Disruptions related to remote work connections, communications capacity disruptions, and new types of email scams and attacks. So again, repeating what was already said beforehand. And operators have been able to guarantee the required performance and transfer capacities and so on. Some services experience slowdown, but nothing big. Yes, change of ways of doing things in ICT services, but also on the side of the personnel. But again, no wide-ranging or otherwise significant data breaches, data leaks, or cyber attacks. This report first version came out in June 2020, and the later version in August 2020. I will skip this because it's just repeating the same stuff that I've already mentioned. What can be raised here is that what was brought up by the respondents to the survey questions, that there were no harmonized guidelines for remote work. They requested for such advice from the state, and the development of coherent situational picture and processes for collecting information should be improved. So those were the main findings. And then we come to October 2020, and I will be very brief. I know I'm running out of time. So what happened is that on Tor network, on some discussion site, somebody put up patient information of over 30,000 patients using services of psychologists. And this corporation, Vastaamo, was the corporation whose patient records everything written down about the meetings with the patients, what they have said, were stolen. And actually the data breach took place already in 2018 and 19, but then the ransomware attack took place in October 2020. So first, the person who had stolen the information, or the persons, they had contacted the corporation requesting them to pay, I think, 400,000 euros so that they will not publish the information that they had stolen. Of course, the corporation didn't pay, so they started publishing information, and then they contacted these individual customers saying that you pay this, and then we don't put your information. But of course, it was all available on the darknet already. And then the whole thing exploded. There have been about 25,000 police reports on the basis of this. And as I mentioned, between 30 and 40,000 people were affected, which is a lot in a country where you have 5.5 million inhabitants. All the different actors reacted. Again, voluntary sector was the fastest. Then the public sector, different sectors of societies, authorities in different sectors rather quickly put up their own information services, advise what to do, who to contact. Please contact the police, make the police report so that we know how wide this phenomenon actually is. And private cybersecurity corporations help the police in investigating. They provided technical expertise and so on. And the case is still ongoing. So it has not been found who was on the back of it, but behind it. And then, of course, the biggest influence is on the everyday life of the people whose information was breached and leaked. So this is a good example of when you have something going on, again, health-related pandemic, and then you have mental health-related thing taking place in the same sector at the same time. The authorities have to react to both at the same time. And then in general, the system survived. So the conclusion probably is that, yes, it's good to have that kind of comprehensive security system. It is able to operate. It doesn't operate perfectly. So what we have learned is that you need to improve a bit here and a bit there. But the main idea is to develop the system further instead of trying to invent something new. So with that, I would like to say thank you, and I'm looking forward to the questions and discussion.
Thanks a lot, Mirva. And without wanting to wake any sleeping dogs, but you have quite some feedback in the chat with regard to your canine colleague. Thanks so much for the presentation, especially for the information on the Vastamo case, which I think might be a bit similar to the situation in Ireland, of course, much more concentrated. Are there any questions to Mirva at this time?
Can I just considering we are going through this at the moment in Ireland, and I don't know how much people are aware, but basically there's been a ransomware attack on our entire public health systems, both what's called the Health Service Executive and also the Department of Health. And so they've been asking for 20 million euros in ransom, and that hasn't been paid, but it means that the entire public hospital system is now paper-based. They've had to switch off all the computers for the past 2 weeks. And to be honest, I may be a human rights lawyer, but I would torture the people that did this slowly if I ever got my hands on them. But I just wondering, Mirva, I mean, how aware are people of the Irish situation? Because I think it certainly seems to be, because it's it's hit the national level rather than just a hospital like in New Zealand. Are people aware of what's going on here? Because it's certainly very serious.
Are people in Finland aware of what's going on in Ireland? Or yeah, so to an extent, yes. The Finnish media, how to put it this nicely, the Finnish media landscape is different. So what becomes news here is what takes place in Finland, in Russia, in the Nordic countries and European Union. So to an extent, yes, it has been in the news, but it has not, of course, been in very detailed way discussed or parallels done, or the Vastamo case is also no longer in discussion in Finland either, because it's kind of, the police is doing the investigations taking place on the background. So it has been noted, but it has not really been discussed to the extent that I think it should be. So what has taken over is the vaccinations, and then what's the state with those in Finland, and then how we are going to get rid of the different restrictions that we have had on the basis of social distancing. So in our media landscape, there seems to be just one issue that manages to get through at the time. And then the other things are a bit on the sidestep. So yes, we know what's going on, but it's not really discussed on a daily basis, unfortunately. But I think those should be.
Thank you very much, because I think it is very interesting, and Marie's saying the same in the UK. And I understand media in every country looks inward. We don't hear about Finland very often, unfortunately, here in Ireland. But I think it shows the risks. I mean, there's huge systemic risks, and the fact that this is probably happening more than we realize, because I didn't realize it was happening in New Zealand until quite recently. I didn't know about the case in Finland. So actually realizing that these are huge systemic risks, and perhaps we're not as aware of how global this threat is and how often it's happening, until certainly for us it happens at the entire country level.
It's also very interesting, like I've been talking to, for example, living in Lapland, I've been talking to local SME owners and all of that. And there have been national studies about this as well. So big corporations usually know the risk and what's going on. SMEs that are the biggest sector in Finland in the industry, they have their mind full of other things, like worrying about how to run the daily business. So there's a lot of let's go with good luck going on. So I think we've been to an extent lucky that nothing as big as what now happened in the Vastaamo case has taken place before. And also there on the background was that the guy who was running the corporation, he's a psychologist by training, but he had coded their own patient record system. And that was also one of the questions, and like how on earth, when a corporation is providing that kind of services, they are able to have a patient record system coded by the guy who owned then the company. So a lot of discussion there. But yeah, I think sometimes it might be too threatening, too scary for the media to pick up this kind of massive cybersecurity related issues here and there. What has happened over the 10 years in Finland, at least, is that there's a lot more news than there was 10 years ago. So the awareness has arisen. But when people and when they start to kind of make the decision in the everyday lives, or the small corporations start to take things seriously, it will take some time. And I think to an extent, the states are also a bit lost with the situation, because this is still relatively new and they don't even know what system is related to what system, because all the different phases have been privatized and outsourced. So it's actually very difficult to manage the overall situation.
Thanks a lot. If we can get into the more general discussion, I'd like to follow up on something that Mirva said, just to make sure that I understand correctly, because this has certainly been my experience working in Finland. Is it correct to assume that non-binding guidelines and so on are something that would be followed in Finland in a way that also for the technology sector, binding rules would not always be necessary?
Can you repeat the question, please? I was reading the chat at the same time. My apologies.
Sorry, no problem. My experience in Finland has been that a lot works through non-binding guidelines that basically the government, the authorities rely on people's common sense to follow guidelines, which is very different from experiences elsewhere, to say the very least. Did I understand you correctly that also tech companies, in particular in this context, are regulated more through non-binding guidelines than through hard law? Would that be a correct assessment? Yeah,
that is true. 10 years ago, there was a big discussion amongst the cybersecurity corporations that they were actually requesting for clearer regulation and rules so that they would know what is allowed for them to do. So can you penetrate external networks and those kind of things, which are considered as attacks to a certain extent. So there seems to be two things. So yes, Finland is trust-based society. So we assume that people use their common sense and come to a conclusion and and usually that works. And also everything that the authorities do needs to be based on law. So first there has to be a law so that the authorities can do something. And then in cybersecurity or in technology sector, then there's also this neoliberal global capitalistic ideology that a self-regulation works better because it's more flexible than state regulation, which is lags a bit behind and makes the system a little bit rigid. And in cybersecurity, especially agility and flexibility are values that are considered and resilience, of course, that are considered of very important, let's put it that way. So to an extent, yes, but I think it's not just Finland. I think that is more or less the whole ICT sector throughout the world. Also, if you just consider how the internet is run and who are in charge of internet governance. So it's private corporations to an extent, and it's ITU that Juha mentioned. And then it's this American-based voluntary organizations of engineers, for example, to whom anybody can join. And there's this idea of freedom and transparency to an extent, but freedom especially so that anybody can go to the meetings of ICANN, for example. I went there when there was one in Helsinki a couple of years ago. Didn't understand much, but it was a cool experience. So I think that it's not just Finland. There might be something on the basis that it's a trust-based society, but I think it's also a global phenomenon all in all, that especially in tech industries, that there is more reliance on self-governance than regulation. In Finland, we don't have cyber law. So the latest development in that field was that we only got intelligence legislation in 2019. Before that, we didn't even have intelligence legislation. So all the legal issues are scattered here and there. They have been integrated to the legislative framework that existed before. And this is rather common approach, but it, of course, then the existing framework guides how you are thinking about the digital issues, which can be both a deficit and a benefit. So that would be my answer to that question.
Thanks a lot. Are there any more questions for Mirva? I don't see any raised hands anywhere. I would have a...
Stefan, can I make a question?
Yes, please.
I was just wondering, when it comes to the infrastructure side, the submarine cables, during the recent years, we have seen this protectionism, and we have seen these national security reviews that have made something like, building a cable or planning a new cable, it makes significant delays, and because the state authorities have become much bigger players than what they used to be in developing of this kind of infrastructure that creates the framework or backbone for the ICT. So have you seen something like this in the, let's say, less infrastructure-oriented side of the ICT, that this kind of national security-oriented concerns affects the way how gives new restrictions to private enterprises, how they run their business, or cause some kind of delays?
So to an extent, the National Emergency Supply Agency and organization, they have been authorized to do that. And they operate in different fields of the society, and information society is one of the fields on which they operate. And the thing is that they can't oblige. So it's all based on voluntary cooperation. And then what is the carrot there is that they will have, the corporations will have access to information, and they will have access to support. They will have to information exchange platforms and those kind of things. So usually that has been enough. And then how their actual arrangements go, those are concealed information. So we'll not be able to say much about those. But how to say this in a different way, also because of the Finnish comprehensive model, I think there's still this ideology amongst the CEOs in the ICT sector as well, that we're all defending the small country because of the previous experiences. So the will to defend the country scores extremely high. So I think as long as we are talking about Finnish corporations, the same kind of ideology works there, and therefore kind of willing to put a little bit more effort into, participating in this comprehensive security arrangements. But then, of course, when you have multinational or big American corporations, the tech giants, which headquarters are not in Finland? So how do you generate this similar kind of belongingness and the will to defend the country? Then that's a good question. But for example, the trade association, let's put it that way, or the union of the different ICT corporations, they are actually also active in organizing discussion events about cybersecurity and engaging different actors there and doing their own information promotion and those kind of things. So they're kind of doing their share in that regard as well. But I don't know if it has increased or has not increased. I think there's been a general increase over the past 10 years, but I don't think that the COVID-19 made a massive difference there.
Thanks a lot. Following up on this, with a strong role on basically relying corporations to do the right thing, I'd have a question to Federica. Did I understand you correctly that the idea of technology transfer in a Sendai framework, that's really something that's more seen in a development assistance sense, rather than what we would often use the term from the perspective of trade law? For example, with regard to, let's say, export controls, are there efforts underway? You mentioned the customs rules that they could be weakened in a post-disaster situation. Are there also efforts underway to weaken export control law? Or is that also something where there would be a reliance on corporations to find solutions?
Oh, thank you so much, Stefan. Yes, well, that's a it's a great question. I think, yes, it's in these international disaster law instruments, I found that it's more on a cooperation side, but this is also, and it seems that because the technology transfer, it's also something that is so there is not a unique regulatory framework at the international level. So it's mainly also mainly upon also the national state when it comes also to import export to really say, okay, I have to put this kind of duties on this kind of products. So I think that there are from the Sendai framework, there is this suggestion, this encouragement state to say, okay, look, that also this is a very important issue, and you should take care of this issue when in this kind of situations, and you should use the rules that allows you to actually waive tariffs and duties on technology products, because I think that also the rules are there in international economic instruments, as we can see, for example, also, and here also a link to a comment that I saw in the chat, I think it was for Adrian, that he very nicely also sent the link to this paper for the way regarding the discussion now in the COVID-19 pandemic regarding the waiver of patent license when it comes to COVID vaccines. And actually, this also links to the fact that there are actually also rules in the WTO treaties that allow for waiver and for compulsory licensing. And the fact is, it's my impression that states are not really are more keen to now for COVID to produce some ad hoc measures for this situation, but I don't think it's really the good strategy, because the rules are there already and can be applied also in this kind of situations. So I don't think it's really the good strategy to keep on producing more specific rules for these specific situations, because there is also the risk then to multiply the rules, and then you have this you don't really understand which rule to apply because there are too many of them and the two parts of them. But
I mean, I'd agree, but I think the other dimension when it comes to the TRIPS, which again, I'm not a disaster lawyer with any expertise, but we have seen a bit of a history with those flexibilities in the TRIPS framework, particularly in connection to the HIV crisis and the difficulties in kind of making use of those flexibilities. Canada went through a process where it really did try to effectively get exports in place. This is several decades ago. And I do wonder whether, yes, we are multiplying rules, but we're also in a situation where the existing rules aren't putting pressure on companies to step up and act. And while I don't necessarily believe that the TRIPS waiver proposals are going to go anywhere in a legalistic sense, they may well fall down because of US opposition. What I think it does achieve is it puts pressure on companies to step up. It's kind of the stick. If you don't solve this tech transfer issue, if you don't solve this know-how transfer issue, there is always a risk that we will step in. And I wonder whether that is partly what's motivating the actions there. I'd be really grateful.
Well, certainly, yes, I do agree. It's also because so it's very interesting that the US proposal, for example, is about the waiver of the patent vaccine, but it's not about the waiver of other IP COVID-19 technology. So there is also this question saying, okay, you waive the patent, but what about developing countries that don't have the technology to produce the vaccine? So where do they, how are they expected to produce the vaccine if they don't have the technology? And if you don't do anything also to encourage the flows of the technology transfer of this kind of technology. So it's this is also also really that's more a political take than the need.
Thanks a lot. Also a bit looking at the time with regard to the responsibility of companies. I'd have a more technical question to Juha. You mentioned that of the 430 to 450 cables worldwide, there are around 200 failures every year, which to me at first had, of course, realizing that this is a huge amount of cable, it's a very long network, but still it means almost 50-50 failure chance for any given cable. From a technical perspective, does failure here mean that the cable becomes totally unusable? And what are the technological possibilities there for internet, for the cable operators to continue to provide services? Just asking from the perspective of the general user.
Yes, thanks. To be honest, I'm not 100% sure what is the definition here for the failure, but obviously it's some kind of damage or then something that basically cut the cable itself. What the companies and operators usually have, they have pre-made agreements that if something happens to cable A, our traffic is redirected to a different cable. And then we have one major change in the cable industry during the last 5 years or so is the fact that we used to have this international cooperation. There was this big telecoms that were forming groups that then built these cables. But now during the last 5 years or so, you have these OTTs like Google or Facebook. They are building. First, they start becoming partners, and nowadays they are building their own cables. So I have understood that Google and players like that, besides their own cables, also they're partially owners in other systems. So they have made sure that they have at least 3 different links above the through these most important links like connecting East Asia to North America. So like Google has, if one of their cables goes down, they have actually their own systems to make sure that they can provide these services. In other players' case, they should have pre-made existing agreements how to act if something goes wrong with one cable. Then we have these examples that if something happens in the wrong place, then it doesn't really help that in Alexandria or Malacca Strait or something like you have an agreement that if our cable goes down, our traffic it goes through the cable that is next to us, because they are within really close proximity in these choke points. So that's a big fail. And then one big problem in cable industry is that we have a really limited number of those ships who can go and prepare. And then those ships are usually located near the areas where the cable failures usually happen. So if something, let's say small scale happens in Alexandria or Malacca Strait, the chances are good that there's a cable preparing ship near to you. But then if it happens somewhere far away, well, let's say we have an island country or community that is connected, through one cable, submarine cable only, it's not an important market, and it's not the place where the cable ship is waiting if something needs to be repaired. So also the preparedness, how soon we can react and how soon we can repair, it really depends where the accident happens. Not sure whether I replied to your question perfectly, but those were the things that came to my mind.
Thanks a lot. So here we once more have the problem that also more remote areas don't really have the redundancy we see elsewhere. And
that's the case. Fortunately, in the Arctic and then island countries are often mentioned as kind of risky areas where they are really dependent on one submarine cable.
Thanks. And there's one more question from the chat from Adrian. A question to Juha with regard to the private entities, mentioning Starlink, the program by SpaceX, setting up private satellite internet infrastructures, which will be natural monopolies. And the question is, are there risks in leaving these infrastructure projects to the private sector? Are there implications of this kind of private ownership for disaster law?
Now, when it comes to disaster law, I can't comment anything. I'm not familiar with those issues. Well, then it's, are there risks related to private ownership in telecommunications? Obviously, there are, and then there are, states take different approaches in the cases that I know best, like in the Arctic, we have one submarine cable system in Alaska that was obviously it is still and it started as a private commercial project, but the U.S. telecom authorities really soon defined that as a critical infrastructure for the national security. And now the company has taken an interesting approach because I'm assuming this also because they are facing difficulties in collecting funding. Arctic is a difficult environment for telecom infrastructure development. So it seems that they are now voluntarily cooperating really strongly with the government authorities, and they are emphasizing how their commercial project is highly important from the perspective of the national security. So I think that's also the way how they are trying to find funding for their project, to emphasizing how important it is to see the connection between their private project and national security needs. So there's the governmental side is more and more interested in telecom infrastructure. They are putting new regulations. I think it was Facebook or somebody who was not encouraged or allowed to land in mainland China recently. But then again, there are also examples where private actors are seeing some merits of showing cooperative attitude towards the governmental side.
Thanks. And of course, infrastructure or private activities which lead to building infrastructure are not disconnected from law. Often you will see in remote areas the idea that it's not really worth it to invest in a lot of infrastructure. Just to give an example from my own experience, in northern Finland, even in the countryside, you have nearly perfect mobile internet at reasonably high speeds, which is something that people, let's say, in the rest of Europe can only dream of, especially in the countryside. I'm originally from Germany, and if I home, a step out of the house in the countryside, this is basically it when it comes to mobile internet, because there is nothing until you reach the next big road. While in Northern Europe, especially in Finland, there's simply a legal obligation for mobile phone operators. If you want to get a license to provide your services, let's say in Helsinki, you also put up mobile phone antennas in the northern part of the country, even though there might be a population density of 1 or 2 people per square kilometer. So that is, of course, something where regulation can play a role, can have a positive impact. And yeah, seeing the comments in the chat, indeed, is almost impossible to understand, I think, for people living in countries like Finland, where the law is such that you're basically guaranteed equal access, or as equal as possible access to infrastructure. And of course, that plays a big role in disaster situations, especially in remote areas and sparsely populated areas. So
Yes,
also a bit of,
yeah.
Yes, please.
I was just, I was wondering whether you were stopping just to add there that when Finland made that legislation, at least Suvi Linden, who used to be a minister back then, she was really emphasizing how Finland was the forerunner, and there was no international models whatsoever. But still, this legislation, when it was introduced, it was supported basically by all the parties. So there was no opposition against this party, although it intervened in the sphere of private enterprises. But it was, at least some people have analyzed that as a reflection of that it echoes the traditional welfare society and regional policies that are really strong in Finland, in Nordics in general.
Thanks for that added information. So we see that regulation actually does play a role also in creating the infrastructure which might eventually be needed in emergency situations, and of course just make life easier also for people in sparsely populated areas. Also important to see that some of these problems also persist when it comes to modern technology, such as internet cables, where we just don't have the same level of redundancy in remote areas as you would have, let's say, with a number of cables going through the North Sea or through the Baltic Sea and so on. All right. Are there any more questions? Yes?
Can I also comment on that a little bit, the Finnish obligatory internet provider thing? I think what is related to it, I run a World Cafes, so discussions with people who live in the most remote areas of Lapland. And one of the things that popped up there, that you do still have issues every now and then, and people did have experience of days-long service breaks when they need to drive to Norway or Sweden to go and give a ring. But that's usually because of the lack of redundancy, like it was mentioned before. So you have one mast, and if that runs out of electricity for a reason or another, then that area is in troubles. So the bigger question, I think, for the future in Finland is going to be that what is good enough connection? At the moment, it's 2 megabits per second according to the law, if I remember this correctly. But when you are digitalizing the society further and further, the services and the platforms also becoming heavier and heavier and requiring faster speeds and all of that. So to an extent, you will have to keep investing in the rural areas so that you are able to keep the people who live in those areas in the loop, and also as citizens of the digital societies. So it's like, to an extent, it's kind of a never-ending cycle. You need to put public money to areas where there's no commercial case, or then you will have to come up with something new because of the technology developing further, and the request and the demands becoming bigger as well. So that is there on the background. So I think to an extent the gaps are going to become wider, not only in Finland, but between the north and south, if that kind of phrasing is allowed. Then two more things. I managed to go through that chat box there, so I would like to comment on Adrian's and John's comments. So I think it would be very interesting. Adrian's comment is about the ransomware and whether we should formalize laws restricting payments to ransom attackers. I think that's an interesting question. I've never thought of it. Maybe it could put some sense to it, but then it kind of collides with individual rights to decide for their own lives and how they use their money, and also the corporates. So to whom would this obligation be? To public sector, to private actors, to individuals? Because sometimes it goes to your private data being your motherboard being encrypted, and then somebody asking money for releasing the information, which they of course never do. So we kind of bump into these freedoms versus obligations, and what is enough regulation but not too much regulation. So that discussion is there on the background, but I think it's a very interesting opening in itself. And then about the COVID situation, in John's question, and how that multi-hazard cyber disasters most likely will become the norm. That's kind of on the background of the whole hybrid threats thinking, that you have something somewhere and then something happens at the same time, or then that when you are trying to keep whatever you're doing under the threshold of war, you're doing a little bit of there and a little bit of there and a little bit of there. So the idea being that you're able to mess up the system so that the system can't continue operating the way it is operating, because there's a little bit of there and a little bit of there, and if they are not cooperative arrangements that are operational, and then if something doesn't work somewhere, then there might be cascading effects, all of that. So I think, yes, it's very much there. And I think it's good that cyber questions have been included in the hybrid framework, because everything is digitalized, but also because cyber provides the means of doing a lot of stuff around the world because of the connectivity. I'm not saying that you can do whatever you want to, wherever you want to. Massive cyber attacks still requires time and resources, skills and money and so on. But yes, I think that is becoming more and more the norm. So those were my comments.
Thanks.
Stefan, can I say something?
Yes, please, Juha.
Yeah, it's just to comment Mirva's point, and then there's a comment in the chat. So first, for the Mirva's comment, you mentioned technological side, and I think we were both participating in the same session a week ago or so, where we talk about technology and something like 5G. You know, there's new technology coming, but it's often new technology for the centers, not for rural areas. So it's not for 5G is not for those areas that still have problems with 4G. So in that sense, it's the development of technology may not solve the problems related to this kind of different risk between centers and peripheries. Then there's a reference to Starlink and satellite internet will replace submarine cables. But this might be a few years information back, maybe 2 years or so, at least 2 years or 1 year ago, there was a situation was so that one modern submarine fiber cable had capacity equal or more than all the satellites, thousands of satellites that Elon Musk was planning to put on the space. So it's the carrying capacity level is still totally different. Obviously, when it comes to micro satellites, their development is also going on really fast. But they clearly will have a place to roll. This is just my personal opinion. One thing that I'm kind of baffled is the fact that you know they are selling fiber-like connectivity through satellites. But why would somebody buy a fiber-like connectivity if you already have a fiber? So in that sense, this microsatellites might be a great solution for areas like Arctic or places where you don't have, where you are missing fiber. But then comes the question that the markets are pretty limited and whether they are whether these remote places are enough to make it profitable. But well, that's a different story. But yeah, that's an interesting case. Also, obviously, it's submarine cables and data centers. They are like a married couple. Now we have interesting deals where these satellites are building satellite landing stations on the roof of a data center. So there's also this kind of cooperation going on and new ideas on these telecom networks. But basically, it's the carrying capacity level is still quite different. So they are playing different types of roles.
Thanks a lot. And of course, with Starlink, there are a number of other concerns, especially in the new space community, in the astronomy community, that you have, of course, a huge amount of new satellites, eventually over 10,000 new satellites, with a huge risk that there will be more space debris, not to mention the effect it has on space observation from Earth, for example. And also, and I'll say a few more comments from Maria and Adrian in the chat with regard to systemic risk. Thanks for the link, Marie. And importantly, as you mentioned, a Starlink system would not necessarily give more to those who already have good connectivity. But of course, the idea there is that you would provide connectivity to parts of the world where you don't have that yet. So the question would then be, how much can this really be practical in parts of the world where we already have good connectivity? But of course, if there would be a major disaster that would take out a lot of the hardware on Earth, like the undersea cables, so that might be some kind of backup potentially for the future. Also looking a little bit at the time, are there any more questions or comment at this stage? And I think I see Federica raising her hand, please.
Thank you. Sorry, just very quickly, because I saw in the chat a question from John. Sorry that I didn't pick up earlier, regarding the IFRC guidelines, which provide some relatively detailed principles around custom duties. Are more practical interest than Sendai, which is a bit vague on this matter. Yes, thank you so much for raising this, John. I think, yes, it's actually, they are very more practical than Sendai, which is very vague in these principles. I think, but still, I think that the problem is that it can, of course, this principle for custom duties can also apply to technology transfer. I think it's, but I think the problem is that we are looking maybe, or these instruments are looking to the problem from only the angle of custom duties, tariffs and taxes, where technology transfer is much more. It's not only about import-export, it's also about actually using then the technology. And of course, this is a very good starting point, but because we first need to let technology enter at least the country, and but then there's a lot to do afterwards. But thank you for pointing out. And
thanks a lot, Federica. And thanks to all of you for your questions, for a wonderful and very insightful discussion. Also to end, sorry, I see one more raised hand over there. Mirva, please. Yes,
before you end this, I think I will be able to meet the one request as well, because my puppy just woke up. So if you give me a moment.
That's excellent, and also shows that we have our priorities straight here. Thanks so much.
So here we are. Haiku says hi to everybody. So Juha, she has a Japanese name. Thanks for this. Sorry.
Thanks so much, Mirva. Thanks to all of you for a great discussion, especially for those of you in parts of the world where this might not have been the most practical time. Thanks to our speakers. And I hope to see many of you again in our next workshop. I don't think we have a date and topic yet. John, do we? No, I don't think so.
I don't think so. But maybe just encourage people to sign up to our website. So it's disasterlaw.net, and you can sign up for future events.
Great. Thanks so much to all of you. And yeah, have a wonderful day or evening, whatever it is in your time zone. Many thanks.
Thank you.
And special thanks to Holly for organizing everything.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Stefan. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.